Hey, good morning, Rutgers Pampa students. This is lecture number 2 of your 4. Last week we finished up with part of a story on utilitarianism, so we're going to quickly go through utilitarianism as a review for 5 minutes, finish up the lecture on utilitarianism, jump into duty-based ethics, and then continue on in the course syllabus. So last week, quickly we reviewed utilitarianism. In particular, we defined it, we talked about the positive aspects, and we were getting into some of the negative aspects. Talked a little bit about this being a consequential ethical theory, focused more on the outcome rather than the input or the action. We talked about it as a tool to measure the level of happiness within a group. Talked a little bit about the pleasure and pain dynamics of Bentham and Mill, as they believe that decision-making comes primarily from our passions, pleasure and pain being the two sovereign masters. We got into discussions on the two types of utilitarianism, focusing on act utilitarianism and then rule-based utilitarianism, suggesting that most rules or laws come from utilitarianism. And I believe I discussed for a few minutes some of the negative aspects of rules coming from utilitarianism, particularly as it impacts minority groups. Spent a fair amount of time talking about the 7 aspects or the 7 variables of how to make a decision from Bentham. When I say a decision, I'm talking about utilitarianism. Discussed the intensity of the decision, the duration, the certainty, the remoteness, the fecundity, purity, and the extent. And then we jumped into Kai Nielsen and his idea of negative responsibility, suggesting that our non-actions are just as important as our actions. And I gave you the example of the innocent fat man. And where we left off was in a train example. Some people refer to this as the trolley example, but my example is kind of modified a little bit. And it goes like this, to refresh your memory. You're on an overpass, and underneath the overpass is a train, and the train is headed towards the train station or the train yard, where there's thousands of people inside the train station. And on the overpass is just you and an old man in the corner of the overpass, or sitting on the overpass, and you hear on the loudspeaker from the train station that there's a runaway train, and for someone to please throw things on the tracks so that the train, which is coming in at a high speed, would be not lost, but would be thrown from the track, and it would be diverted from the train station ahead, potentially saving hundreds, if not thousands, of lives. Yet some of the people on the train may be hurt and or killed. So the dynamic says, what can you throw on the tracks if in fact you cannot throw yourself, at least you're not going to throw yourself first, and there's nothing else around. So the story implies that perhaps you throw this old man who is on the overpass with you. And I go through this in multiple settings in the one-on-one the live class, changing that dynamic of the old man. But what we're trying to get at simply is, would you throw the old man if our non-actions are just as important as our actions? So if we choose to do nothing and walk away, possibly many people will be hurt. If we decide to do something, possibly throw the old guy onto the train tracks, which may, we're not sure, divert the train from killing the people in the station. What do you do is really the question. And something for you to think about. So I'm going to just ask you to pause for a second. Think about that. Would you throw the old person off the overpass and onto the train station if in fact you could? So take a second, think about that. We'll be right back. Okay, so where are we? Some people would probably say, yes, I'd throw the individual off the overpass if in fact I can save thousands of lives or hundreds of lives or any lives. Some of you would say there's no way in the world I can do that, and some of you would bring up, well, that's murder or some other duty or some other law suggesting why you would not do it. But for many of you, you would say yes. You would think about it from a utilitarian calculation and say it's better to give up one life in exchange for hundreds or thousands of others. And this gets us to the dilemma with our non-actions. Sometimes our non-actions are not about us but about others, and impacting or interfering with other people who have nothing to do with the situation whatsoever. So what we're getting at here, and we're going to see this in even the next example even more, is we are starting to have a conflict between this concept of utilitarianism, or the action, or the outcome, versus the action. So do we just focus on the outcome, or do we also focus on the action? For many of you who are thinking about this seriously would probably say, I have a real problem with the action itself, despite that maybe the outcome would be better. So these are some of the things we're going to continue to talk about throughout the course. And I can change the dynamic. I can make it be criminals on the train, and if it's criminals on the train, some of you might change your calculation, your utilitarian calculation. You might say, well, it's criminals on the train, and I provide less value to criminals than I do non-criminals. Now, I'm pushing you in this direction because what we're going to see here is that most of us, if we like it or not, tend to make decisions based upon valuing people or valuing individuals. And it's very important for us when we're thinking about this to take into consideration the ugliness of that decision, or the possible ugliness of that decision, and some of the biases inherited inside of our decision. Most recently, I modified this example to suggest that the elderly man that was on the overpass was a known criminal, pedophile, and child abuser, and that instantly changed the dynamic for many people in the classroom, and they said, of course I'm going to throw that person off because their life is vile and not worth as much as others. So, not that this example is mainly about valuing life. I just want you to think about this for a second. Most often when we think about utilitarianism, we are valuing or putting values on not only non-human things like hard assets, but we're putting value on life. We're putting value on people. And it's important for us to understand that, because we're going to come back later in the course looking at examples such as the Pinto case by Ford and other cases where in fact we put value on life and we come right out and say that. Yet in many of those situations my students tend to have real problems. So I just want you to think about this now, put it in the back of your head, so when we get to that part of the course, you can remember that we all, in some extent, value life. So the last thing I'm going to go to before we move into the O'Malley's case is we're going to talk a little bit about the magistrate and the threatening mob. So the story goes like this. There's a magistrate, ruler, king, local ruler, and there's a threatening mob in his city. And the threatening mob brings to the magistrate an individual, a person. And the threatening mob says to the magistrate that this person broke the law. And the magistrate takes this accused individual and says, okay, I will look into it, and should this person be guilty, he will be punished. Well, magistrate takes the individual, does his own investigation, and finds there's no wrongdoing with this individual. So he comes back to the mob and says, this individual did nothing wrong based upon my investigation, therefore he's innocent and I will do nothing. And then the mob says to the magistrate, well, if you choose to do nothing, we will pillage and destroy the city and cause great harm. That's where the decision comes in. And the decision for the magistrate is simply this. Does he prosecute the individual who is innocent based upon his own investigation, or does he let the individual go at the risk of the city being destroyed or pillaged? So many people in my course, it's typically split, say no, we let him go. We let him go for the simple notion that in the short term, people will be hurt, the city may be destroyed, but that's only a short-term loss in comparison to a long-term loss of justice being destroyed, which can have devastating impacts in the long term. And I always enjoy hearing that one because it clearly brings up that we're starting to understand this idea of utilitarianism and the calculation of it. What I like about that particular response is that my students are starting to recognize that there's a short-term aspect of calculation and a long-term aspect of calculation, and both of them should be taken into consideration. On the other hand, I have students who say, well, I should let the mob dictate, and therefore I'll prosecute this one individual because by prosecuting this one individual, it benefits the most, and it benefits the most in the short term, and therefore that's the proper decision using utilitarianism. Well, you see that these are in conflict, and what's in conflict is how we look at this decision, some in the short term and some in the long term, and I think it's important for you to take that into consideration. Definitely want to look at things in the short term, but before you say yay or nay to your decision, make sure you look at the long-term impacts. Make sure that the decision, as I showed earlier, doesn't flip on you. And when I say flip on you, what we saw earlier in the course was the 7 components of how we how we calculate utilitarianism, and we look at fecundity, which is will it occur in the same way in the future. And what that means is the outcome that you have now, will it be the same? And the reality is, if you do this once and give up on justice, maybe it happens again and again and again, and ultimately justice is destroyed. So let's move on. There's also a philosopher named Bernard Williams, and this sets us up for the next chapter. Bernard Williams, in his article against utilitarianism, he makes many arguments, but the argument that I want you to really focus on is this argument of integrity. And what he's saying is that we only focus on the outcome with utilitarianism and not the action itself, and not on the person creating the problem. So when you think about magistrate and a threatening mob, who's creating the problem? The problem is being created by the mob and not the individual, or not the accused. And when we have that, we have an integrity problem. And the integrity problem suggests that we have to focus on the individual who made the decision and not necessarily any of the bystanders or the second derivative or the people that are associated with that decision. Lastly, I want to also talk about Omelas. Now, the story of Omelas is a pretty straightforward story. It's a story written by Le Guin. It's only a few pages in length, and it has some real philosophical ideas and concepts with respect to utilitarianism, but it's probably not 100% accurate, mainly because Le Guin is trying to use this as a critique of utilitarianism, but more importantly, we think she's trying to use this as a critique of capitalism and the free market. Let me just walk you through the story for those who have not had a chance to read it yet. But there's this city called Omelas, stands for Salem, Oregon, and in this city, where this city is a utopian city, where everybody is happy, everybody has everything they potentially want. They have drugs, and they have money, and they have anything and everything they could possibly think of which would make them happy. Yet, in order to have this happiness, there is an individual who has to be in a box, and this person lives in a box, and this person does not have a normal existence like the rest of the population. And the story suggests that if this person comes out of the box, the rest of society will lose its utopianism or its happiness. So the person in the box represents a minority who may be responsible for ensuring the happiness of the majority. Now the story, at least by Le Guin, she's suggesting, or others are suggesting, that her story represents a dichotomy in capitalism, which is the people within inside of Salem, Oregon, and all of their happiness is predicated simply on this person in the box. And this person in the box can represent exploited people throughout the world. For instance, if we're talking about the West, particularly the U.S., is our wealth in the United States predicated on the work of people throughout the world who are exploited with lower wages and people who are figuratively in a box. Now I bring this up to you because I think Le Guin has some interesting arguments to at least consider. Is our happiness in the West, is our happiness in capitalism based upon a minority, or is it based upon something else? So I don't think any of us would disagree that capitalism has some idea, or capitalism has some parts of this. No doubt about it. There's people throughout the world who spend a fair amount of their time being exploited or are exploited on the backs of the wealthy or on backs of capitalists. And that is true. But the question I ask you as business leaders or future business leaders, are the people that are really working for us overseas, are they in a box? And when I say a box, or can they get out of the box? Is there any opportunity for them? And I think where Le Guin misses the argument a little bit is this. Take, for instance, India. Take, for instance, India 50 years ago, 60 years ago, and you look at India 50 and 60 years ago when they started to open up the economy slowly and they started to bring in capitalist ideas. The people within India were making very, very low wages. Not to say that there aren't certain people within India making low wages today. But over time, what has happened with India? Certain people got out of the box. The levels of wealth increasing in India are pretty dramatic today. People who were making, a couple $1,000s 10 or 15 years ago are making $40,000 and $50,000 in U.S. today, which is great. That doesn't say that there's not people in India that still are exploited, but there are people getting out of the box. Now, I highlight this story again for you because I think as business leaders or future business leaders, you have to spend a fair amount of your time thinking about this, because if in fact you want to be an ethical leader, you have to make sure that people are not in the box. Any minority group, any vendor, any supplier, anybody you're working with that is providing you a substantial level of value needs to be compensated for that same value. And they need to have the opportunity to grow. They need to have the opportunity to get out of the box. They need to have the opportunities similar to you, perhaps not in the same scope, since they are vendors and we are working in a capitalist market and a competitive market. But you need to make sure that they have the opportunity to grow and to grow in the same vein as yourself. So I leave that story for you to contemplate. We might see something like this in our case, not sure, but something for you to think about. Are our vendors and suppliers and employees that work for us, are they in a box? Or are they in a box with the opportunity to get out of the box based upon how well they do? and how well the company does. So for you to contemplate throughout the next couple of weeks. So that's it for utilitarianism. I'm going to jump into deontological ethics now. Deontological ethics. So this is the second component, or the second principle that we are going to discuss with relation to decision making. As mentioned last week, utilitarianism is a decision-making principle. Deontological, also known as duty ethics, is the second principle that we're going to focus on. So there's three things I want you to be able to understand from this lecture. I want you to be able to define deontological ethics, understand how to apply it or use it, and understand how it differs from utilitarianism. So, what is a deontological ethic? Deontological ethic focuses on the action, not the outcome. Focused on the action. According to many of the writers, the rights or the right acts are not determined by the consequence, but by the intrinsic quality of the act itself. That tends to be a Kantian idea and a Ross idea. And there's two types of deontological ethics that we're going to talk about: Kant's categorical imperative and Ross's idea of intuitionism. So what does Kant believe about ethics, and how does Kant and Ross differ? What I like about both of these, Kant sets the stage, and Ross tends to pick up the ball, if you will, or tends to take the Kantian idea further with a concept of application, or how to apply these ideas. So Kant believes that all ethics are absolute. Means all decision making, all actions have to be absolute, or all ethical decisions have to be absolute. And he's suggesting, or he's saying, that there's no diversion from an absolute principle whatsoever. So an act that is considered wrong is always wrong, and an act that is considered right is always right. Whereas Ross suggests that, by the way, Ross tends to agree with Kant. He says, yes, there are absolutes, but sometimes these absolutes come in conflict, and we have to think about how to apply the absolutes. Sometimes, according to Ross, one absolute overrides another absolute. This is what we will refer to as a quasi-absolutist stance, and I'll take you through that in a second. Kant also believes that without absolutes, our passions and desires get in the way of our reasoning. He is and focuses, or criticizes, I should say, Bentham and Mill in this idea of utilitarianism. He thinks that passions tend to lead to bad outcomes, and that all of our decisions should be based upon reason and logic, and that decisions must be the same all of the time in order for them to have some type of moral foundation. As I said, reason and logic are the main determinants of ethics. And he also says, quote, act only on the maxims, which means principles, whereby you can expect everyone else to do the same. So in order for something to be a principle, everybody has to be able to do it. It cannot be based upon one group having an ethic and another group having a different ethic. So underlying all of Kant's ideas is this concept of goodwill. And what does this concept of goodwill suggest? Well, it says that sometimes people act with good intentions, but bad things happen. Right? Many of us, probably in the classroom, have tried to do something good, and it came back to bite us. The old adage is, a good deed is never left unpunished. Well, that's really what he's saying here. Some people act with these good ideas, yet bad things occur or bad outcomes occur. But he also says sometimes people act with bad intentions, yet good things happen in the end, which, you know, if you think back on your life, sometimes you probably have have done this. You did something that you personally thought was probably not the most ethical decision, but it had a good outcome. And it was luck, right? So according to Kant, the outcome does not matter, but only the will of the action itself. And it's the idea. You enter a decision with good intentions. He has 3 propositions, and they all have to be met in order for something to be a duty. First proposition of duty is that actions are good when they are done of our duty and free of personal interest. Now, as a recovering economist, I have been trained, thoroughly trained in the concept that everything has self-interest or personal interest, and that nothing or no decision is void of it, meaning we can never do something against our interest. Well, it's a tautology, as some of you may know, and a tautology means that it can never be proven false. So, according to economists, every action is out of personal interest, and this is where I have a little bit of a challenge with Kant and this idea of personal interest, or this idea of removing personal interest. Though I have to say that Kant does a really good job in trying to make a good argument here. And if there's one argument that I think, I think this is one of the best arguments I've heard of somebody doing something without personal interest. So let me just unpack the idea. When Kant was writing this, his article on the categorical imperative, or when he was making his propositions at that time, one of the conversations in the mainstream was about merchants charging a fair price. And many people were saying, well, it's a duty for a merchant or a business person to charge a fair price. And duty meaning it's a responsibility, or there's something intrinsically good about that. And people were saying that's moral, that's a moral duty. And he comes back and he says, I'm not sure if this is a moral duty. Right? He says it's not a moral duty because why do people charge a fair price? They charge a fair price for the simple notion that if they don't charge a fair price, people won't come back. So they charge a fair price so customers continue to come back, and they continue to come back. Why? Because it increases the wealth, or the possibility of wealth for the business person. So according to him, according to his first proposition of duty, charging a fair price is not a duty. But he says, let me give you another example. He says, think about a person who wants to commit suicide because the pain of life is greater than killing himself. The pain is just overwhelming. And many of you in the class, you may have somebody in your life, hopefully not too many of these people, that actually were in a great deal of pain in their lives. Could be grandparent, parent, cousin, aunt, friend. I personally have one person in my life who was in this situation, that the pain was just so overwhelmingly awful from cancer that they repeatedly said they wanted to kill themselves. They repeatedly wanted to take their own life to end that extreme levels of pain. And he says most people won't take their own life. He says they don't take their own life. Why don't they take their own life? Well, many of these people don't take their own life out of a duty. In my situation, the duty was to their faith. The duty was to the sanctity of life. And the duty was to not taking a life. And he says, if you look across all actions, people won't take their own life. And if people choose not to take their own life, even though it would be better for them to do so, that is a duty because it is void of self-interest. And if you take this idea that a duty has to be counter to self-interest, well then there's a few of these duties that we can hypothesize, right? So for instance, is stealing a duty? Well, if I can walk around and steal stuff and it makes me better off, but I choose not to do it out of some duty, well, then that is possible because that is not of self-interest. Or engaging in a contract. Sometimes it's okay. Sometimes it's advantageous for us to break a contract. But we choose not to break the contract. And why? We choose not to break the contract because I have a duty to uphold my contract, right? So in order for something to be a duty, it has to first be, all self-interest needs to be removed from that. And that's self-interest for everyone. His second proposition relates to the moral worth of the action itself, suggesting that you don't focus on, as we talked about, you don't focus on the outcome, you only focus on the action, and the action is more important than the outcome. So in order for something to be a duty, we have to remove our thought process with respect to the outcome. It doesn't matter. Take it out. And if we take it out, then we're good. And so what does this mean? This means that in order for something to be in order for something to meet the second proposition, it cannot be put in there as a means to an end. It means we cannot put it into, we can't make it a duty if it helps us. Meaning I'm not going to use it to provide benefit to me. And then lastly, the third proposition of duty, pretty straightforward, is that the duty itself needs to respect the law, which is based on reason and the will for self-preservation, which is, look, pretty simple. Categorical for the categorical imperative, the third proposition is really obey the law and obey the spirit of the law. So what is this categorical imperative? It's an absolute, unconditional requirement that allows for no exceptions, required and justified as an unto itself. All decisions that are considered absolute can never be violated. You could probably take away from this, some people that have this absolute stance, they're probably not the most fun people to be around. They tend to be very staunch in their approach, and Kant was no different than that. So where's Ross come into this equation? Well, Ross, as I said earlier, Ross is okay with Kant, right? If they're both living today, they probably get along, though I don't know this to be true. But I look at Ross and I'd probably say, yeah, I'd like to hang out with Ross after you see his ideas. But I definitely probably wouldn't want to hang out with Kant. Kant tends to be very absolute. Ross tends to be, yeah, he's a real ethical guy. But, he gives us a little wiggle room. He's going to give us a little bit of wiggle room on how do we make decisions. So again, Ross argues against utilitarianism. But unlike Kant, duties are not absolute. When I say duties are not absolute, he believes in absolutes, but the way we apply those absolutes are a little bit different. And he calls it the application of duty. And in a sense, one duty can be overridden by another duty. And he refers to these as prima facie duties. I'm not going to expect for this class for you to be able to define the prima facie duties and which duty overrides the other. All I want you to know is that when you have duties and those duties are void of self-interest and they meet the categorical imperative, is that sometimes one duty may be more important than another duty based upon the circumstance. But nonetheless, they're still duties. And I'll give you an example here in a second. So yeah, let me give you this example. And I give this example in my face-to-face class as well. So assume that I come walking out of my house one morning to get the newspaper or to get the mail. It's very early in the morning, and I look across the street and I see a colleague of mine, Dr. Smith, and Dr. Smith is a world-renowned brain surgeon. And I give him some morning greetings, and I notice as soon as I do that he falls to his knees and then falls on his face, and he says, "Help!" So I run across the street, nothing on me, no phone, in my pajamas, and I recognize that Dr. Smith is having a heart attack, and he tells me he needs to get to an ambulance or a hospital as soon as possible. So my keys are in the house, my phone is in the house, but I notice down the street, not too far, is a hospital, and I can take the doctor and put him in the car and drive him to the hospital and get him the required help he needs. But I don't have my keys on me, and I don't even know where they are, and it would take me some time to get them. But lo and behold, Dr. Smith's neighbor is preparing to go to work, and she's warming up her car in the front of the house. So what can I do? Well, I can run in my house, find my keys, find my phone, make a call, have the ambulance come up, and by that time maybe Dr. Smith is dead. But knowing that Dr. Smith is a good person and I care about Dr. Smith, I decide to do something else. I decide to steal the car or take the car from his neighbor who is waiting to go to work. I take the car, I put Dr. Smith in it, and I speed down to the emergency room to help Dr. Smith live. Dr. Smith lives. So let's unpack that. Okay? If it was Kant that was looking at that, he would say that is absolutely, no pun intended, incorrect or unethical, because stealing is an absolute. You cannot steal under any circumstances. And in order for me to get help for Dr. Smith, I have to first steal the car. So that to Kant is improper. Can't do it. So let's jump ahead to Ross. Now Ross would say, well, it's a little bit more complicated than that. You have a duty to help this individual, and you have a duty not to steal. So what do we do? Well, many of us would look at this and say, what's the best decision that increases the good for society? Now instantly you should say, well, that sounds like utilitarianism. And it is. Sort of. Okay? It's a decision-making concept using absolutes. So we're saying one absolute overrides another absolute, but it's up to me, the individual, to figure out how to apply those absolutes or how to apply those prima facie duties. And in this situation, I stole the automobile to protect the doctor. Again, Kant, no, can't do it. Ross, possibly we can do it, if in fact by doing it the good increases. So that's the real simple idea of intuitionism. We use our intuition to make a decision of how we apply duties. Let me give you one more example. Again, an example that I tend to use in my face-to-face class. And we tend to have a lot of discussion around this, but obviously without having the opportunity to see your faces and ask you questions, I'll just walk you through how this typically has worked in the past. I am meeting up with one of you. You graduate, you get your MBA, you're now a young professional doing really well, and we stay in close contact with each other. And one day, you and I decide that we're going to grab a drink and catch up. So we decide that we're going to meet up at a bar one evening to catch up on life, to catch up on your career, and see how things are going. Nothing really important, just more of a catch-up. But on my way home, or I'm sorry, not on my way home, on my way to see you, I get a call from a friend who's in desperate need of help. And the friend is distraught. She's on the phone, she's crying, she's telling me how she needs to see me because I need to help her with a decision, and that it's absolutely important. So, thinking through Ross and this idea of intuitionism, I decide not to show up for the drink with you, but rather assist a friend who needs my help. Now I get to my friend's house and I ask her the question, hey, what's up? What can I help you with? And she says, I'm going to a wedding on the weekend and I'm just so upset because I don't know what shoes to wear. Now, for some of you, you say that's silly, but that was a true story. Context was a little different, but it was a true story. And I asked this story because I want to get your opinion. Is this what would Kant say about this decision, and what would Ross say about this decision? So you think about it, Kant would say, no, you're not going to break the promise to your colleague in order to help out another colleague, right? Because a promise is an absolute. We don't break promises. Where Ross would say, well, based upon the information it sounds like more good would be done if you break your promise with your colleague by getting a drink and you go help out your colleague who needs you to help her pick out shoes. Now, In hindsight, you look at this and say that was a stupid decision because she should have been able to pick out her shoes herself. So this brings up another issue, which is decisions, ethical decisions, are not based upon the information known after the fact. It's known, or the ethical decision is based upon the information known and knowable at the time of the decision. Many times I hear people say that was an ethical decision because they have the information that came out afterwards, and they didn't know the information that was provided prior to or at the decision. So again, I'm going to just make sure you understand that it's about the information known and knowable at the time of the decision. And in this case, what was known and knowable at the time was I was meeting with a colleague for a drink, or I had to help out another colleague who appeared to have a serious problem. Doesn't matter if that serious problem turned out to be something silly as picking out shoes. So let's continue and move on. So there's another writer, McGiver, who spends a fair amount of time talking about this thing called the Golden Rule. Now, I'm not going to expect you to know McGiver. All I want you to know is this idea of the Golden Rule. And the Golden Rule goes something like this: do unto others as you would have others do to you. Now, this Golden Rule, most often we hear about it, at least in the U.S., people tend to think that this is a Christian idea. Do unto others as you have others do to you comes out of the Bible, particularly the New Testament. But what we should also know is that this concept is in the Old Testament. This concept is in the Quran. This concept is in some of the ancient mystic texts of the East. This text was in some of the Buddhist ideas, some of the Zen ideas, Zen Buddhist ideas, Confucius ideas. So the point here is that this idea of do unto others as you'd have others do to you is a concept that has been around for a while and fairly widely adopted. And I read a book recently that somebody said, well, business ethics only needs to focus on the Golden Rule. Nothing else, just the Golden Rule. And when I first picked it up, I thought, maybe that makes good sense. But the reality is this isn't really an ethical principle to help us make decisions. This is really an ethical approach, meaning we use this to engage in ethical decisions. I'm going to listen to you if you listen to me. It doesn't help us solve problems. If you think about deontological ethics or you think about utilitarianism, both of them are put there to help us make arguments with respect to ethics. Help us come to some realization of what might be more true or true in its binary form. Okay, so do unto others as you would have them do to you is a very straightforward idea, but it's not an ethical decision. Cannot help us answer an ethical dilemma. I'm just going to give one more example here. Assume if this were true, and we could use it as an ethic, assume that I had a colleague of mine who was in prison, and I went to the prison one day, and we're talking about the Golden Rule, and he says to me, well, I think we should abide by the Golden Rule, and we should I'll do for you if you do for me. And he says, if in fact I were in prison, I would help you escape. Because if you were in my situation, or if I were in your situation, I would do it. Right? So the reciprocal of this is the possibility of doing something that is wrong. Right? I'm going to do it for you if you do it for me. Or we see in this case with the prisoner that obviously I'm not going to help somebody get bailed out of prison. So it doesn't necessarily solve an ethical dilemma. It's not an ethical principle. It's just an ethical concept. It's what we refer to as an ethical approach. And lastly, I'm going to take you through these two ideas which I use in some of my my executive programs here in the university and outside of the university. The first test is called the newspaper test, and the second is the parent-child test. I'll start with the parent-child test because that's one that I tend to use more often than the newspaper test. And it goes something like this. If I have a decision to make, and I make that decision, and my children find out about that decision tomorrow, will they still respect me? Can I make a rational argument to why I did it so that my kids still respect me and my decision? And if the answer is yes, they'll still respect me, then that's probably a good starting place. If the answer is no, most likely it's not even a starter. And if you're not sure, probably time to really think about our ethical concept. Take out utilitarianism and deontological ethics and now rigorously debate the issue. The other one is the newspaper test. If I make this decision today and it was published in the New York Times tomorrow morning, would I be okay with that? Would I be okay with the rest of the world knowing my decision? And if obviously the answer is no, then it's unethical. If the answer is yes, I'm okay with it and I could support it, then that's probably a good starting place. And I say starting place because I'm still going to plead to you that you use utilitarianism, deontological ethics, to help you support your decision-making ideas. So that's it for deontological ethics. I'm going to stop the recording now. I'm going to save this as recording number 2, and I'm going to go into recording or lecture number 2, part 2.